Katie shared a few facts and statistics. Let me just add several more. It is estimated that approximately 18.6 of all adults in our country experience mental illness in any particular given year. Likewise, approximately 20% of our youth aged 13 to 18 live with some kind of mental health condition. 75% of all chronic mental illness begins at the age of 24. And approximately 19% of all adults over the age of 65 suffer from depression. So these are very real things, and oftentimes, we shoot off statistics, they're numbers and so forth, but we have to remember that these statistics and these numbers and these facts represent people. They represent people in our own families. They represent mothers and fathers and grandfathers and friends and neighbors and so forth. They're not just numbers, they're about human beings. And though we are particularly or more and more aware of these because of our increase in medical knowledge of one sort or another, they've always been around. They're not particularly new. They're not endemic of a more stressful world, although we may contribute to it more and more. More than once in the Gospels, Jesus confronts a person suffering from such situations and conditions. It's just that back then, they didn't have the knowledge or the language to express and share them. They didn't use words. They didn't know things like bipolar disorder or personality disorder or depression. But I suspect, given the violence of the world at that time, the wars and the famine and all the stuff that took place, I have to believe there were a lot of people who suffered from PTSD. I mean, it's just recently, is it not, that we acknowledge this among our veterans. And as Veterans Sunday comes up, we want to say thank you to all those who have served. But in those days, they just labeled you as different. They isolated you. They felt you could not be mainstreamed or a part of, quote, a normal society. And so they said you were demon-possessed. You were demon-possessed, and they put you away. They put you away. As in the case of the young man Luke writes about, he is on the other side of the lake, and there's so many interesting elements and descriptions within this story. He's on the other side, and he is unclean because of his condition, and he is living among tombs in the cemetery. He's already considered dead, and he's naked. Now, we might just think that means he has no clothes, but that means he is just extremely vulnerable. And that's the condition he is in. Dead to the world, even though he is alive. And by healing him, Jesus risks, this is significant, Jesus risks being unclean himself. Jesus dares to set aside the stigmas of the day to go probably into the cemetery. He's on Gentile land already, and to acknowledge this individual and heal him. And it's scary. It's scary to do those things. And it was scary for the person to be healed. He says, what do you want from me? It's scary to acknowledge that we might need help, that we are in some way cracked. But Jesus acknowledges him, and in so doing, destigmatizes, I think, someone who is struggling deep inside and has been tossed aside by his family, his home, his world. So we know this subject is not new. This subject is simply human. Not new, but human. One with treatments that have advanced to a great degree in our age, but still leave us with things that we struggle with, like isolation. People feel isolated. People feel like those other people look at me differently. You know, one of the things that happens with depression is as we get depressed, we want to be alone, right? And the more we are alone, the more we get depressed. It just becomes this vicious cycle that takes us down and down and down. So it is a situation that's real. It's a part of our families. It's a part of our community. And as a church, it needs to be acknowledged and raised up as a part of our ministry. Because as those who claim to follow Jesus, then we must emulate Jesus in what we do. So I'm going to offer 4 thoughts for us all to mull over as how we can respond to this in our lives personally as well as corporately as a church. And the first is to not isolate through judgment those who struggle with thoughts and emotions that they might not even understand themselves. To not push them aside or stereotype them or in some way judge them, as she talked about a child who's afraid of people wearing glasses. Imagine that. My wife and I were somewhere yesterday, and there was a young child, just acting out in a tremendous way, and the parents just weren't doing anything, and you're thinking to yourself, well, how come you're not? But I suspect the child had something going on, and the parents were doing what they were supposed to be doing, and God bless them with the strength they need to take care of that child in that situation. We need to not judge others so quickly, but rather be open as a community that we might offer the kind of acceptance that leads to trust. Because you really have to trust someone else to share your weaknesses and your vulnerabilities and those places that you were cut or bruised. And in a world and society that tells us we have to be strong, especially men, it is frightening to admit that we have fears and phobias that can overwhelm us. And let's be honest, many of us have struggled at one point or another with an emotional or mental issue. We felt alone as though no one else understood. When my father died 20-some years ago, I went into a period of depression, sadness, depression, and so forth, and, tried to fight my way out of it, so to speak, and part of the manifestation of that was certain sounds or people or songs or smells. I just uncontrollably have tears running down my cheeks. It just happened. It was a part of the grief process, we know, but it would happen in the middle of sermons. It would just happen. And really, one of the reasons I decided it was time to depart from that church and seek a new parish was when it got to the point that one of the members came up to me and said, it's time you got over this. Your job is to minister to us. Now, the point is, we may take a deep breath at someone saying that, but we say those things to one another. And we judge. And we can't do that. We have to know that words cut deeply many times and have meaning far beyond what we think. We're very trite with our language. Very, very trite with our language. Oftentimes people don't think about it. Men especially will say something to women. Oh, it looks like you've lost weight. Well, it's not a funny thing, because if you have, and in a culture that promotes women being thin and beautiful and all this kind of stuff, if you have someone who's dealing with anorexia or bulimia, they say, wow, if I look good thin, I'm going to look even better thinner. And so you actually, by your language, contribute to something they're already struggling with. We throw around words too easily and too simply, forgetting that everybody here is carrying something. So the first thing is, don't isolate people through your judgment, either actions or words. Secondly, be sensitive to what we say, which is what I lead into that, and how we act towards others. and realize that everybody does have cuts and bruises and abrasions and scars. We all carry them, and they can be reopened quickly. But the flip side of that is that our cuts and our abrasions and our hurts can actually be points of ministry to others. There is good news that can come out of our pain. A number of years back, Henry Nouwen wrote a famous best-selling book called The Wounded Healer. And he talks about how he discovers, in terms of pastoral care, how when he ministers from that point of hurt within his own life, he can empathize and be sensitive to those people in a way he couldn't before. That when you know pain yourself, you can see the pain and talk to the person who's experiencing it. It's the reason why for many years hospitals, when they used to do bypass surgery instead of stents, they would send someone in to visit the patient preoperatively who had been through bypass surgery, so that they could tell them and anticipate and give them hope that, yes, it's going to be tough, but there is life at the other side. We need people, we need others who walk with us. Don't patronize us, but walk with us as we pass through the dark shadows of our human existence. Thirdly, it's important to recognize that as a church, we should provide not merely spiritual and emotional support, but the services that people struggling require. You know, we all talk about homelessness, but in this country there are 750,000 people, it's estimated, who are homeless and sleep outside somewhere at night. It's also estimated that a third of them, or 250,000, express various manifestations of mental illness. You know, and we can make all kinds of judgments about them and why they're there and how they got there and all those kinds of things. But before we do so, remember, this is probably the way the young man looked and appeared to Jesus, who's in the cemetery. He's running around naked. And Jesus doesn't say, you know, what'd you do? How'd you get this way? Jesus acknowledges him and seeks to help. I think my wife has a big heart for homeless people. And I know that when we eat places, she often will buy an extra meal to give to someone or something like that. But I remember one time when she stopped and she was talking to someone, I don't know if they were on a bench or a street corner, and she asked the person's name. And the person said, "Thank you. Nobody ever asks that." Which is why it's so significant that in this congregation, we often use funding. We have a pastoral discretionary fund. And there are times when we are able to provide financial assistance to a family or to a youth or to someone who needs outside assistance and can't afford it, so that they can get professional help, because, you know, we're like triage people. That's not we're not trained in that. But we can get them to someone who can help them. And it makes a difference. There are people who are saved. So that's the third thing. And the fourth one is, it's imperative that we accept this role as our calling with open minds and innovative spirits. We forget sometimes that the church is able to do things that other organizations oftentimes, because they get government funds or are tied to other laws or restrictions, they can't do it. And so we can fill in the cracks. We can do things. My previous church had a situation. We started a program. It actually got presented by Congressman Manzullo at the United States Congress. We discovered we had a family in the church who had a child who had a developmental disability. And the reality was, when that child got out of high school, the programs, government programs ended, and they either went into an institution or they became the total responsibility of that family for the rest of their lives. And the parents wanted their child, who was an adult, to be mainstream. They felt that that was very, very important. And so we were trying to find, how do we do that? How do we get them a job? Because people are afraid and people don't know. How do we get them a job? How do we get them independent living? And I was fortunate enough in that church to have a member who belonged to Little City, which is one of the largest providers in the city of Chicago for people with developmental disabilities. And so we partnered, and he used his resources, and we used our resources to find them jobs in the world. In fact, this is very interesting to me, one of them was in Algonquin, Illinois, there's a place that makes the hoses for your radiator. And someone has to scan those hoses to make sure there's no cracks or flaws in them before they go out. What I learned is people with Down syndrome have the ability to look very, very carefully at just such an item. That is their gift. Where someone else might become bored, they can do it. And so that became the job for someone. And we got them a house so that they could live together. And they even did a church service. One of them played the piano. It was interesting because they repeat. And I don't remember the gospel hymn he was playing, but he started at the keys on the bottom here, and he didn't finish till he played it all the way through and used every key on the piano. So we sang this song a long time. But it was embraced by the congregation because this was something we could do. Do you understand? Little things make big differences. An example is this ramp we have in the labyrinth. For years I came here and there's 2 steps, right? It's not a lot, and people would say, well, there's a ramp there, there's a ramp there. It's not like we're not accessible, but there wasn't a ramp at our main entrance, and so we put one in a year ago, and people use it all the time. It says welcome. It says no matter who you are welcome here. Which is really how the story of Jesus and this young man concludes. Did you notice he goes through all this sort of thing? He is, in essence, this young man becomes Jesus' first convert and evangelist. He sends him home. Isn't that a wonderful image? The man says, I want to go with you, Jesus. I want to be a part of what you're doing. And Jesus says, no, go home. Go home to your family. Be reincorporated and assimilated into the life that you deserve. His healing was not just one of being right in his mind, but that of being accepted and welcomed and whole in society. Which is what all of us need, isn't it? Don't all of us want to belong? Don't all of us want to have family and somebody who genuinely cares? That is a basic, fundamental human need, to not feel separated. Which is what all of us need and desire. Welcoming others is something we can all do. In fact, it is the one thing everybody can do. There is no reason everybody can't do that. So whatever ways you can, this day and every day, as Nike says, just do it. Amen.